A sword with a rippling surface became so famous that people eventually gave it almost supernatural powers. Damascus steel was said to hold an edge that ordinary blades could not match. Later stories claimed it could slice a falling silk scarf, cut through another sword, even bite into metal without losing its edge. Those claims are mostly legend. The strange part is that the real material underneath the legend may be more impressive than the myth, because smiths were controlling a complicated steel microstructure centuries before anyone had a microscope to tell them what they were doing. Pick up a modern kitchen knife sold as Damascus steel, and you will probably see beautiful waves running across the blade. Those waves are real, but they do not automatically mean the knife was made like the famous historical blades. Modern Damascus is often pattern-welded steel. A smith stacks layers of different steels, forge welds them together, folds or twists the billet, then grinds and etches the blade. Different layers react differently to the acid, so the pattern appears. It can look spectacular. It can also be excellent steel. But the old material at the center of the Damascus legend worked differently. Many historical blades associated with Damascus were made from a high-carbon crucible steel, often called Wootz. Instead of building a pattern from layers, metalworkers produced small ingots by heating iron with carbon-rich material inside sealed crucibles. Important production traditions developed in South Asia, especially in parts of India and Sri Lanka, and the resulting steel was traded over long distances. The ingot could then travel far from the place where it was made before another specialist forged it into a blade. So even the name Damascus steel is a little slippery. Damascus was a major trading and manufacturing center, but the raw steel behind many famous blades did not simply come from a secret mine underneath Damascus. A Wootz ingot does not look like a finished sword. It looks more like an unimpressive lump of metal, the kind of thing you could leave next to a forge and nobody would photograph. Inside it, though, the chemistry is unusually demanding. Historical Wootz steels contained a lot of carbon compared with ordinary low-carbon iron. As the steel cooled inside the crucible, carbon and tiny amounts of other elements did not distribute themselves perfectly evenly. That unevenness later became useful. Now take that ingot and forge it too hot. You can ruin the structure that will eventually create the famous pattern. Work it within the right temperature range, heat it and cool it in the right sequence, and particles of iron carbide, called cementite, can organize into bands. After the blade is polished and etched, those carbide-rich bands help produce the watery lines associated with classic Damascus steel. The pattern is not painted on. It is not a stack of alternating sheets. It emerges from the internal structure of one piece of crucible steel. That sounds minor, but it matters. In the 1990s, metallurgist John Verhoeven and bladesmith Alfred Pendray worked on reproducing this kind of steel and studying surviving historical blades. Their experiments showed that very small amounts of carbide-forming elements could strongly affect the pattern. Vanadium became especially famous in this research. In some cases, amounts measured in mere parts per million could help cementite particles form in repeated bands during thermal cycling and forging. A smith did not need to know the word vanadium. The ore, charcoal, crucible, furnace, and heat treatment could deliver the chemistry for him. And that may explain part of the old mystery. A traditional smith could know the procedure perfectly and still get different results if the iron ore changed. One shipment of raw material might contain the right trace elements, another might not. A furnace might run a little hotter. An ingot might cool too quickly. A blade might spend too long at a temperature that dissolves the carbide structure the smith wanted to preserve. There was no digital thermocouple, no laboratory certificate showing the alloy composition, no neat box marked 0.004% vanadium. There was a fire, a crucible, experience, and a lot of consequences for getting it wrong. This is also why saying, "The recipe for Damascus steel was lost," is both useful and misleading. Traditional production networks did decline, and particular techniques and material sources disappeared. But there was probably never one single recipe locked in one workshop. Wootz-type crucible steels were made across regions and centuries, with variations in raw materials and methods. Trade changed. Industrial steelmaking expanded. Ore sources changed. Craftspeople died without passing on every detail. Several links in a long chain could break, and the final product would vanish, even if nobody had dramatically burned the secret instructions. One detail makes the story even messier. People have been trying to rediscover or reproduce Damascus-like crucible steel for a long time. European scientists studied samples centuries ago. The Russian metallurgist Pavel Anosov experimented with patterned crucible steels in the 19th century. Much later, Verhoeven and Pendre produced blades with surface patterns and microstructures closely comparable to historical Wootz Damascus. Modern smiths also make crucible steels with convincing watered patterns. So, lost forever is wrong. Better to say that an old craft tradition faded, and researchers had to reconstruct the combination of composition and heat treatment that made it work. Then came a finding that pushed the legend into the age of nanotechnology. In 2006, researchers writing in Nature reported carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires in a sample from a 17th century Damascus saber. The story was irresistible. Ancient blacksmiths had somehow made nanotechnology without knowing it. Headlines practically wrote themselves. But this needs caution. The finding came from a particular sample, and the interpretation of those nanoscale structures has been debated. Even if nanotubes are present, that does not prove they were the secret behind the blade's reputation. The well-established part of the story is the carbide-rich microstructure and the way it forms during processing. Put an antique Damascus blade next to a good modern knife, and another myth falls apart. Historical Damascus steel was remarkable for its time, but metallurgy did not stop in the 17th century. Modern tool steels and powder metallurgy knife steels can be engineered with carefully controlled amounts of chromium, vanadium, molybdenum, and other elements. Manufacturers can control heat treatment with temperatures a traditional smith could only estimate from the color of hot steel. A modern blade can offer better corrosion resistance, predictable toughness, and excellent edge retention. Damascus steel is not a cheat code that modern metallurgy somehow forgot. A cheap online knife with a dramatic wave pattern proves the other side of the problem. The word Damascus now describes appearance as much as history. Some blades are genuine, pattern-welded steel. Some are high-quality laminated knives with a patterned outer layer around a different core steel. And some inexpensive products imitate the look with superficial treatments. The visible waves alone do not tell you the exact alloy, heat treatment, toughness, or edge performance. A beautiful pattern can sit on a mediocre knife. A plain gray blade can outperform it. So why did the old steel become legendary? Partly because it was genuinely sophisticated. Producing high-carbon crucible steel with a controlled internal structure was an impressive achievement in a world without modern analytical chemistry. Partly because the watered pattern made quality visible. You did not need a microscope to notice that this blade looked different. And partly because weapons collect stories. A sword that already comes from a distant trade network carries a moving pattern across its surface and performs well, is perfect material for exaggeration. The silk scarf story is a good example. A sufficiently sharp blade can cut very light material under the right conditions, but there is no reason to treat the famous falling silk tale as a standardized historical laboratory test. The same goes for claims that Damascus swords routinely chopped through other swords or gun barrels. Those stories tell us how people remembered the material, not how every surviving blade would perform in a controlled comparison. What remains after the legends are stripped away is still unusual. South Asian metalworkers learned to make a high-carbon crucible steel. Long-distance trade moved the ingots. Skilled smiths learned how to forge them without destroying the structure. Tiny chemical impurities helped organize hard carbide particles into visible bands. Centuries later, scientists used microscopes, controlled furnaces, and chemical analysis to work backward from surviving blades and reproduce the effect. And there is something almost unfair about the result. The old smith did not know the atomic explanation. The modern metallurgist may know exactly what vanadium and cementite are doing. Yet both can fail if the temperature, chemistry, and timing are wrong. Damascus steel was never magic. It was materials science performed by people who had no modern language for materials science. That is probably the best reason the steel still fascinates us. The famous waves are not just decoration. They are a record of ore, carbon, cooling, heat, hammering, and accumulated craft knowledge, frozen into the blade. The legend says somebody once knew a secret formula, and then the world forgot it. The better story is that generations of craftspeople learned to control a system so complicated that losing only a few pieces of the system was enough to make the result disappear.
Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. See you in the next one!